Hello, welcome to another episode of GenServer. In the previous episode, we were able to start our GenServer process and interact with it. So we interacted by the GenServer process by sending messages to it, and we achieved that using the GenServer call of ret3 function and the GenServer cast of ret2 function. However, those are not the only functions we can use to interact with the GenServer process. There's also the process send function and the process send after of ret3 function, which we can also use to interact with our GenServer process. To understand how those two functions work, I'm going ahead to open the interactive shell. So to open the interactive shell, use the ix-s mix command. Here I want to use the process send and the process send after function to send a message to the current process. So the current process where I am right now in the interactive shell will be the ix process. Let's create a variable for the current process. To get the PID of the current process, use the self function. This PID refers to ix process. Now let's send a message to our current process. We can say hello. Hello with send. The process of send takes in 3 arguments. The first argument is the PID, the second argument is the request of the message you want to send to the destination. Then the third argument are option, which you can pass as an empty list if you don't want to pass anything. You can say it returns an atom OK. To get the message sent, use the flash function. And here we get hello with send. So that message was sent to the interactive shell process. Then we have the process send after. So both the process send and the process send after, they send a message to the destination given. However, with the send after function, sends after a specified delay. We're going to give the same PID. Then we shall tweak this message a bit to differentiate them. Then we need to provide the time, which refers to the delay time in which the message will be sent. Let's say 5 seconds, which equals to 5,000 milliseconds. We get a reference with the send after. So let's confirm if this message will reached the destination. You can say hello with send after. That's how the send and the send after works. They both send requests to the destination given. So in today's episode, I want us to use the process send after to send requests to our GenServer process to be able to retry sending the failed messages. But now we're going to use this process send after to set up a periodic check in our GenServer process. This periodic check will be a repetitive process once our GenServer process is started. And after every specified period, it will be able to check if we have failed messages and retry sending them. So first, before we dwell into that, let's have a recap of what we did last in the previous video. In the previous video, we were able to add 2 callback functions, the handle call, which is handling the requests sent by the GenServer call to get the current state. And then we also added the handle cast, which handles the request sent by the GenServer cast to send a message to the given phone number. In the handle in the handle cast, we focused on a happy path flow. However, whenever we're working with a third-party API, we need to put in consideration that something might go wrong. And in the case where maybe you are depending on a third-party API to send messages to the given phone number, so this message may fail to be sent. And the factors that contribute to this are many. For example, there can be a network connectivity issue, or maybe a timeout because the API is taking too long to process that kind of information. In that case, we need to work with both the happy flow and the sad path. So in the client API that I defined earlier, I had put that into consideration. If we send a message to a given phone number, so this is emulating a sad path. If we send a message to this phone number, it will always result to an error. Otherwise, it will be sent successfully. So we are emulating how an API in a real world scenario can work. Therefore, we need to refactor this before we get into retrying sending the failed messages. To refactor this, let's add a case statement. In our case statement, we have two output values. The send message either will return an OK. I'll just put it as status because I want to return the status, or it can return an OK, an error, status. The status can either be sent or failed. Here we are interested with the status because that is what that function returns to us. After that, next is to update here. This needs to be updated to status because it can either be sent or failed. Let's start our GenServer process. And run the new changes. We're going to use the GenServer start function to start our GenServer process. We need to have the module name, and the argument, I'll pass it as an empty list. Our GenServer process has been started. We can go ahead and make requests to it. We are going to call the GenServer cast. So GenServer cast is expecting the paid as the first argument. Then let's pass the request message, telling it to send message to the given phone number. The request will be made successfully. Now we need to also add the wrong number, in which will result to an error. Let's get to the current state and see if the current changes that we have added is actually working. To get the current state, we're going to use the GenServer call function, text in the PID and the requests. We have both failed and successful messages. Next, we want to retry sending these messages, and I've mentioned that we're going to do that by setting up a periodic task. This periodic task needs to be a repetitive process that will always check for the failed messages and try resending them. To make that possible, the first thing we need to do is we need to set up a periodic check once the server is up and running. To do that, we're going to add process send after function in the init callback. This means once you start the GenServer process, the periodic check will also be started. So let's define the process send after. The PID here will be the current, will refer to the current process. To refer to the current process, we can use the self to get the current PID. Then the request will be retry because we want to retry sending failed messages. And we can do this after every 5 seconds. Whenever we define a process send after function in the GenServer process, it will trigger the handle info callback. Therefore, we need to also add the handle info callback, which will handle that request. Let's define handle info callback. Handle info works similarly to the handle cast. Checks in the request message and the state. The request message here is retry and also need to pass the state. The return value are also similar to that of handle cast. We shall return no reply and the state. We are still not going to perform anything in here. So let's see if it will listen to the message by printing this message, listening to retry. Consider listening to retry request. We have defined the handle info callback and also we have set up the process send after, which will send the message retry after every 5 seconds. Let's check if these new changes are working as expected. We have set up the process send after in the init callback. That will mean that we have to start our GenServer process again to trigger that request. After 5 seconds, we are expecting. I forgot to recompile. So let's start again. In 5 seconds, we're expecting it to have a printed message. New changes are working. In order to achieve a repetitive periodic check, we can't be starting the GenServer each and every time because we need a periodic check whereby if the server is alive, the periodic check will be running without being triggered every time. Therefore, to achieve this, once our handle info listens to the requests, we need again to trigger the request to be sent. So that means the server will keep handling this on its own and you don't have to do this manually. Let's call the send after. Pass the send after in here. Pass the current process PID. Same request retry and the same time 5 seconds. Let's recompile this. Expecting a repetitive periodic check. I'll need to trigger the GenServer again. So I'll start the GenServer process. First recompile, I had already recompiled. So whenever the GenServer process is alive, we're expecting it to listen to the retry request after every 5 seconds. Yeah, and that is working. Next, we need to implement the logic of retrying sending of failed message in the handle info callback. We already know this, the kind of information we are working with. This is what we are working with. The implementation we need to add in the handle info is the retry of the failed messages. So what we want in here is retry sending of failed messages. Let's add a quick sudo. I can just copy this. So the sudo helps in understanding what flow we want to work with. So the first thing we want is if the message is failed and the number of retries is less than the max retries, we retry sending it. Failed messages will be status needs to be failed and retries needs to be less than the max retries. This is what we want to work with. Then once we send that message, we also need to update our state to have the correct information. Second thing we shall do is update the state. The correct information will be, remember the state has both the failed and the sent messages. If we have the sent, we're not going to do anything with it. So this will be in the state. And if we have the failed and we retry it, we need to update that information. At least we need to know if it was sent in the second retry. And also we need to know the number of retries that was done. So that is the correct information that we need to capture. Okay, now let's get started. We need to have the failed messages in here. So therefore, we need to know how we can retrieve the failed messages. And the function I was thinking of is the enum split with. How the enum split with work is it takes in enumerable and anonymous function. It's good to explain this, train it in the interactive shell. So let's say we have a list. Let's say we are working with a list of numbers. So maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Then we want to separate this list to have odd numbers and to have even numbers. To do that, we can use the enum split with. Let's pass in the list, the anonymous function. We need even and odd numbers. With the even numbers, if we divide that number by 2, it returns 0. With the odd numbers, if we divide that number by 2, we get a remainder. If we divide a number by 2 and get 0, so you can see we have two separate lists. We have a tuple of two separate lists. So the first list contains the even number and the second list contains the odd number. That's the same implementation I want us to add in our logic. Implementation here will be, I want to get the list of failed messages and I want to get the list of completed messages. So completed messages will refer to the messages whose status is failed or sent. But now the difference, yes, the status can be failed because we retried many times and we also reached the max retry, but still are getting failed status. So that means that we have completed sending a request to this API to send the message to the given phone number, and therefore the retries here can be 0 to max retries. 0 works for those that were in the first attempt it was sent. If we have another retry, maybe we try to send it and a status was sent again, but for the failed, their status needs to reach the max retries. Now we have the full information and we know what we are working with. So let's go ahead and implement our enum split width. Split width function. From the state, we need the phone numbers list. Pass it the anonymous function. Let's end that. It takes in an argument, which is the phone number. Instead of passing this, maybe let's pattern match, because we know that the phone number is a list of maps and we are interested with the status because we are passing a check for the status and also the retries that were made. Next, let's add that check. So status here needs to be equal to failed, and so this refers to ampersand refers to the AND condition. So if true and true, it returns true. If true and false, it returns false. It's false and true, it returns false. Status needs to be equal to failed, and retries made needs to be less than the maximum retries. So the maximum retries, we are retrieving it from the state. Enum returns in a tuple. The tuple here, we check the response that we got here. The first tuple, the first list contains the information that matches the condition. This is what we are going to expect here. The first list will contain the information that matches this condition. Here we'll have failed messages, and then the second one will be the completed messages. We are going to work with both information. For the failed messages, we are going to make retry of sending the messages again. Then for the completed messages, so remember we have separated these two lists and our state still contains the failed messages. We need to have correct information, so we will join the completed messages with the retried messages. So let's go ahead and retry this message, send in this message. I'm going to use the inner map to iterate through the failed messages. So the failed messages, we're going to send requests to the API. We're going to send requests to the API by calling the send message. Now we have a status again for the failed messages. Then we need to update our failed message. This is a map, and what we need to update is the status and also the number of retries. So we need to keep track of the retries made. Let's update the status. Then the retries we updated by adding it by 1. So in every periodic check, we are making a request to send a message to the given phone number, and we need to know how many requests were made to this API. Therefore, let's take message.retries and add by 1. We have our message updated and we have here the retried messages. Now we need to also update the state because it contains both failed and completed messages. So we need retried and completed messages now. The state here we're working with is a map. So we're just going to do phone numbers. So both are lists. And to concatenate lists, we can do completed messages and retried messages. We have our updated state. Now let's do a recap of what we have done. When our GenServer process is started, it will start the periodic check immediately, and that message and the retry request will be sent to our GenServer process in the next 5 seconds. Once that request is sent, the handle info will handle the retry request, and in here we'll try sending messages to the failed request, but by first we need to get the information of the failed messages, and we do that by separating the failed messages from the completed messages from the list of phone numbers, from the list of phone numbers. Then once we get the failed messages, we call the send message function, give it the phone number whose message will fail to be sent, and we get the status from that request. Once we get the status, we update the information that we are passing to the phone numbers placeholder, and that is the new status if there is, and the number of retries that we have made to the API. After that, we call the send after once again because the periodic check needs to be a repetitive process. So this check will be done after every 5 seconds, and our state will also be updated with the completed and the retried messages. Now let's run this and see if the logic is working. I'll need to recompile and also expand the interactive shell. So it's listening to the retry. Let's see if we have any messages in here by calling GenServer call. Okay, this function is escaping me. Okay. Yeah, we still haven't retried message, and you can see the number of retries that has already been made is 5. Let's call it again. It's 4, sorry. And you can see we have the maximum retries. I want to start our GenServer process once more because I want to override the default max retries by passing it as 3. Once we do that, let's send request to the GenServer process. So that is the message that will be sent successfully. Then let's have send request to the wrong number. So this is the wrong number, which will result to an error. Let's do GenServer call to get the current state. Already we have the first retry made. It keeps listening to the retry request after every 5 seconds. Let's get the current state again. Already 3 requests have been made for the failed message. I've tried sending We have tried sending message to the failed phone number thrice, and that information has been updated in here. So we can't do any more requests to the client API. And to confirm that is by getting the current state, and you can see that the number of retries is still 3. So you are not making requests to the client API anymore because we have reached the maximum retries that we need to make. That's it for this episode. In this episode, the focus was creating a periodic task for retrying sending the failed messages using GenServer process.